All right, welcome everyone. We will be getting started here in just a few minutes. Thanks for waiting. All right, we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to the first ProductTank SF meetup in the new world that's affected by coronavirus. I want to thank you all for attending tonight. We have some really good speakers lined up for you. You should be watching this on YouTube, on our live stream there. You can feel free to chat in YouTube there. And if you'd like to tweet about this event on Twitter, that would be great. You can use the hashtag ProductTank. ProductTank is a large organization that was founded in London in 2010. It's now in over 160 cities and has over 150,000 members. It's a global meetup, and our ProductTank SF chapter is one of the largest, and it brings together the local product community, product managers, designers, engineers, a lot of different types of people to share experience and knowledge. So it's a really good organization, and we do a lot of awesome things for the community. We encourage you to join our Slack channel. The Mind the Product Slack channel has over 15,000 product people, so it's a really good way to connect with people and chat with them. There's job postings in there and all kinds of great stuff for you to check out. Tonight's event, this is the ProductTank SF co-organizers. We have Albert Chen as a speaker curator for this evening. Charlotte is the meetup evangelist who handled our meetup event. We have Mike Wong, who's the volunteer manager. Arvind is handling venue curation, and tonight he's doing our technical work to make this stream possible. So bear with us if you have any issues with audio or anything. We'll be trying to work through those. And I haven't heard anything, so I think that the stream is working properly. And I also worked on speaker curation for tonight's event. We have a lot of other co-organizers who help us out with various events at different times, and They're all really great people, and I encourage you to check them out on LinkedIn. Talk to us, reach out to us. We all really like talking about product and love learning, and we're all trying to be involved in the community as much as possible. We also have the meetup that you probably used to find out about this event. So, make sure you join it if you've heard about this from someone else. We have regular events there. A lot of them are really great. The in-person events are super fun. There's usually, refreshments and a lot of good mingling and great talks. So it's a great opportunity to meet all kinds of product people and network with them. Just a note also to get involved with us. You can reach out to us, and we're always looking for speakers, people to help find speakers, people to host events, people to talk to. It's really an awesome community, and I'm pretty new to the co-organizer group, and everyone here has been super nice, and it's been a great learning experience to get involved in these events. So I would highly encourage any of you to talk to us and get involved. Normally we have our events are hosted by some awesome partners, and they provide the venue that we do the event and the refreshments. Tonight's event would have been hosted by Amplitude had we done an in-person event. So we just wanted to give them a quick shout out and say we look forward to partnering again with them in the future. That brings me to tonight's speakers. So at Corel, where I work, I'm in a hybrid role that includes both product management and design responsibilities. It can definitely be quite a handful. So I'm especially pleased to present tonight's speakers, Audrey Crane from Design Map and Yuhki Yamashita from Figma. Audrey is a seasoned designer who's just released a new book about helping people understand the importance of design within organizations. And Yuhki is a veteran product manager currently working on a design app that's really changing the way designers collaborate. Really excited for the talks tonight, and without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Audrey Crane to tell you what product managers need to know about design.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am very sure that something is going to go wrong tonight. It's strange to be really nervous while sitting in a room alone.
I know, right? I'm feeling the same way.
But I'm excited for when it goes wrong and we can all go, yay, that was it. And then it can be behind us. So thanks so much for the intro and for including me. I feel super lucky in this, I guess, the after times to be part of ProductTank's the San Francisco team's first virtual meetup. And honestly, just to be working in tech where we can still be going to work every day and making stuff happen. So I'm appreciative of the ProductTank San Francisco team for keeping life moving forward and the chance to do that. So jumping in, my name again is Audrey Crane. I started working in tech actually back in the olden days. One of my first jobs was at Netscape. I had, again, the great good fortune to work for Marty Kagan. I also worked for Hugh Deverly, who's one of the most important people in my field, although he doesn't promote himself enough. He's not as well known. I worked with Ben Horowitz and a lot of the people who at the time I didn't realize were so important, but certainly were, not just in what I learned in my career, but in technology writ large. And over the past couple of years, I've worked inside of companies, leading teams, and outside of the companies as a consultant. So that's kind of my background. I'm one of 4 partners at a company called Design Map. So we do product strategy and design mainly for enterprise kind of B2B clients. So that's kind of my background. And the story of the book is that we had a client call us, this guy who I will leave nameless, but he was the CEO of a small business that was about 200 people. And he said, I was an engineer. I grew up with technology and I understand that. I've learned about HR and finance and operations. And I've heard that design is really important. and that it can really make a difference to my business, but I don't really know about design, and I don't know what I need to know about design. And I thought that was a really fantastic question. Clearly, he doesn't need to learn Photoshop or Figma, right? And I could hand him Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, but it's not clear that that's going to help him really either. So I started calling around to other people who were leaders in business and great design advocates to try to find out how they got to be that thing. And it was interesting that there was sort of, 90% of exactly what you would expect to hear from these folks, and then 10% kind of these gaps in their understanding and in very strange places. So we decided to write this book. The idea that one might write a 15,000 word book on design is a little bit silly. It's sort of like writing a very short book on everything that you would ever need to know about the law. So it oversimplifies and it leaves some things out, but it's useful kind of laying some groundwork. And honestly, it's really targeted not just at CEOs, but at business leaders writ large. So what I hope from that folks on this call will get from my part of the talk is that you'll hear some stuff that you certainly will hear some stuff that you know, but maybe my reframing of it will be useful, and hopefully there's going to be some things here or there that you don't know that will be especially useful to you. I'm Aud Crane at Twitter, and we're also going to give away 10 copies of the book. So you can direct message me and we'll send a copy to the first 10 people that DM me, but of course, feel free to tweet as I go through the talk. I'm going to have these big red slides, which are opportunities and things that trip people up. So my talk is sort of organized from beginning to end. First, the idea that you need to have the idea to invest in design in the first place. And sometimes when I talk about this, I go through a lot of examples and kind of pound it into people's heads. I made the assumption that the folks that come to ProductTank San Francisco already know about the value of design. And by that, I don't mean anything fuzzy or vague or mushy-gushy, but specifically the hard numbers in terms of return on an investment. I'm not going to read this to you. You guys can screenshot it, and we'll send the deck out afterwards. But these are some useful places to go for information on the ROI of design. And I think that you as business leaders taking data and material like this to your executives to make a case for creating or growing a design team has a lot more impact than a designer saying, hey, look how important we are. So I want to make sure that you have these, and there's a couple more that I could send people if they're interested in more. One that I did want to call out specifically under that first bullet point was that this report that came out a few years ago that IBM and Forrester did together about the impact of IBM's investment in design has an index of data that's really rich and useful. And one of the numbers that jumped out for me is that when they measured how many projects returned no profit before the design investment, it was 10%. And after the design investment, it was 2%. And I find that astonishing. And in particular, I point to this number when I'm talking to engineers and I say, look, you bled and sweat and worked late for these projects that ultimately weren't profitable. Doesn't that drive you crazy? And wouldn't you like your hard work to go into something that's going to move the needle for the business? So asking engineers to make the case to create or grow a design team. So I'm going to leave that there rather than going through all the details. But I also just wanted to call this out. Leah Bewley was an analyst, and now she's leading some of the work at Envision. And she talks about the ROI of design is this. So design is making employees more efficient and productive because teams can make decisions more quickly with better alignment. And also non-designers aren't doing design work. That puts products in the market more quickly that are more innovative, which is where we really think of design shining. And then that drives higher customer lifetime value because it better meets the customer's needs and ultimately, obviously, improves the company's market share and leads to growth. So this is just kind of level setting, I guess, everybody on the value of design. You would be amazed at how often we meet people who believe in design, but not in a specific KPI relevant way. And we ask those people, and I would ask you to expect designers to be capable of making specific, meaningful, and significant contributions to your company's success. It's beyond me why companies build design teams or bring on design consultants and then don't really value their work. I think the reason is that nobody has drawn a straight line between their work and actually creating value. So we try to do that, and we ask our clients to do that. So assuming that we all are in agreement that there's some value in design, then we can talk about bringing designers on. I'm sure you guys are all Marty followers, so I don't need to go into the ratio too deeply. This is the ballpark that he talks about, 1 to 8, depending on how complex your product is. And then the next question is, where might we get these designers from? Should we build an internal design team, or should we bring in a freelancer or a consultant? And might sound crazy to hear a consultant say this, but I will tell you that you should hire. Design is and should be a core competency, so you should hire an internal team. Having said that, they're incredibly complementary, and so having an internal team and then flexing in various ways with a freelancer or a consultant can be really helpful. So I'm assuming that product managers are not doing the actual hiring, but just to talk about the building the internal design team for a moment, I would assume that I would hope that you're on the hiring committee, so you're interviewing people. And I would just say, caution you that if the recruiter is trying to get somebody to do both design and coding, or do both marketing design and product design, or do all of the product design, that's a signal to designers that you're not totally clear on what you're hiring a designer for. And I wouldn't expect very many people to respond positively to that, or to be equally great at all of those things. Having said that, once you get into the interview process, and again, I would really hope that you are part of the interview team. And if you're not, I have some strong words for whoever's keeping you out of it. Of course, you want to look at whether their work is great or not, but the work that you see in their portfolio is going to be the product of a collaboration with somebody else, maybe a much larger team. So that's not the only thing to go on. Maybe you don't have the same taste as the product manager that they worked with last time. So instead of just looking at the end product, I would suggest that you ask them to walk you through the process so you can have a sense of how they think about things. And also in the interview, I would always look for what else they're interested in. So I would hope that either they're marginally interested in the technology, like what is this built on? What's the stack? How do you guys build a design system and maintain it? Or they're asking about the business, how the business works, how their work is going to contribute to the bottom line, or even both. But if they don't, then that might be a sign that they think design is just important because design is important, and I would be nervous about that. And then finally, in the interview process, I would always take the opportunity to be critical of something that's in their portfolio. And you don't need to be a jerk about it, like that's ugly, right? But to say, I'm not sure that I understand that choice. I might have done something differently. I might have done something like this, and see how they respond to that. And this is one of the opportunities that I wanted to call out. This is my rule. So now anybody who ever interviews with me knows that I'll be critical of something. I broke this rule one time with somebody in an interview, and our future with that, we went ahead and hired her. I just felt like, well, maybe she's really nervous. I felt like I was maybe too harsh, and she was quite defensive in the interview, and we brought her on, and that went pretty badly. So The thing is that this kind of, why did you make that decision? I'm not sure that I agree with it. This is the kind of conversation that you're going to be having every day, all day with this person if you bring them on. So you need to make sure that it's a conversation that you can have comfortably and productively. I would never break that rule. So once you have your internal team, whether that's 1 or 3 or larger, you can use partners or freelancers actually even to help you build that team. So the thing about using, again, freelancers or consultants is that they can help you get started right now on the project that you're working on, and they can help you hire an internal team. They help you look more attractive as an employer because you're literally saying we're investing in design. Design is important to a company, and we're spending money over here. So that any designers that you're hiring full time know that you really believe that it's important. And then I really like the internal-external pairing, because when you do bring that external person in, whatever work that they do, as long as it's reasonably close to the internal person, or even like working on the same team together, that makes the internal person a better steward for the work going forward. So you get better value out of the work. They understand the decisions that were made. They're equally invested in it, and they can carry the work forward. So it's a really nice pairing. When you are talking to partners or freelancers or consultants that you might consider working with, similarly, you want to make sure that you like the look of the work, but you don't want to only look at the final product, because you might have different ideas than that client had. So you like to see work in progress. Obviously, it seems obvious to ask about how that person measures success in the projects that they worked on in the past. And yet you would be surprised at how many clients we work with who are hesitant to set KPIs with us, but it's something that we always push to do. And then, of course, you want to ask, how is this going to end? So what's going to happen when you guys leave? What's the handoff look like? Or is there some tapering off of our work with you? And then finally, I would always ask, what don't you do? There are a lot of marketing agencies out there in the world that saw like, oh, there's this whole digital world and we got to get into that. And yeah, we do digital product. And I know very few to maybe none that do marketing and product design really, really well. So I would ask, what don't you do? And if the answer is like, no, we do it all, then I would be cautious about working with that person. But in any case, if you have internal designers, you want to make sure that there's a cohort for your designers. And again, assuming that most of the people on the call are product managers, I know that you're not the boss of the designers, but you can still keep an eye out for how you can give them an opportunity to work with other designers. Even if they're the sole designer on the team, again, bringing in a freelancer or consultancy can be really helpful. At Design Map, I can think of 5 designers off the top of my head that we hired, and as part of the interview process, they told us, I'm the only designer in my company. I'm just so tired. I want somebody to work with that I can learn from, and that when I get stuck, I can bounce ideas off of. So make sure that they have somebody to work with, just as you have this cohort with ProductTank. So now we've hired. Congratulations. I hope everybody is drinking. We'll have a toast and move on to working together. So I should drink. It's bad luck. I just want to mention, presumably when beginning work on a new product, there's some learning that happens. Entrepreneurs and founders and product managers are really all going and talking to users now, which is great. I remember when Marty started saying that, 10 years ago, and I said, it'll never happen. But I think it has. I'm certain that all the product managers on the call right now go out and talk to users all the time. I wanted to tell this story. So there's a really interesting bit of research where a researcher went out and stood in front of a mall or something with a clipboard and a bunch of stuff and a drink. And then when people came out of the mall, they'd say, "Hi, would you mind participating in this research study for me? It'll only take a few minutes." And the person says yes. And they say, "Okay, great. I just need to, could you just hold this drink for me for a minute?" And then they get a picture, a photograph of a person out, and then they take the drink back and they show the research participant the photograph of the picture. And they say, sorry, the photograph of the person. And they say, "Can you tell me what you think about this person?" And it's a very neutral face. And if the drink that the research participant was holding was cold, they're more likely to assign negative attributes to the person. If the drink they were holding was warm, and mind you, they were holding this drink for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, then they're more likely to assign positive attributes to the person. So it's a really subtle thing. It's kind of amazing that this few minutes with something apparently unrelated can impact the outcome of a study. Now, you take a product manager, who I think are all entrepreneurs, CEOs, founders, and the reason that they're successful is because they're charismatic and they get people excited about their ideas and they're good looking and fun to be around, right? Like, you are a great evangelist for your ideas, which is why you're a successful product manager. You're not the boss of anybody, but you get people excited about your stuff. So now you take that excitement, entrepreneurial spirit out into the world, and what you may learn is how charismatic you are and how likely you are to get people to go along with your ideas. So and we do some workshops around this, but what I ask people to do that are not researchers or designers who have some research training is learn to wear a different hat when you conduct research, because the risk is that you get basically bad information when you go out and do research, and then you make decisions based on that information. Learn to just be neutral, or send somebody else out into the field and go along with them to have the conversation. Send out somebody a little bit less charismatic than you are. Once you've done the work, then you're into once you've done the research, then you're into the work. And I point business leaders to this book, The Elements of User Experience by Jesse James Garrett. There are lots of frameworks for the parts of user experience. This is a pretty old one, and so I like it because it's foundational for a lot of designers, and it can help you build a shared vocabulary with designers. So basically the idea, and I redrew it partially because it's ugly and partially because it's hard to deal with horizontally like this, but often people think of design related to software products, they're just as fonts and colors, like what they see. On the other hand, there's sort of like strategy. What's the whole big thing? What do users want? But in between there are these other layers, scope, structure, and skeleton. And I'm not going to get into it too much. It's a great read if you're interested. I think it's, again, a good foundational book. But the idea is to avoid the mistake of thinking that design is just fonts and colors, what you see. And this is another opportunity, using designers deeply. Design really ultimately is about, one of the things that design provides is risk management. But designers can only help manage risk if they're involved. And they go nuts if they're only involved at a superficial level for the most part. On the other hand, I'm starting to hear more and more companies that have heard this design thinking phrase and really think that, okay, we did design thinking, so now we've done design, and that's another risk. So once you're working together, and we kind of have these 5 layers split out, there's the idea of giving feedback. I would say that providing the initial vision is what you guys can do that nobody else is really doing. And, of course, this is done in collaboration with the designers, but that feed forward kind of vision is a lot more important. If we got great initial direction, then the feedback would be less important. But at some point, of course, you're going to get called on to give feedback. So I have a designer, you can tell by the hipster glasses, and then a product manager looking at something that the designer did. And I wonder if you've ever had this happen where the product manager is like, "Oh, I love the blue." And the designer's like, I don't really care about the blue. Actually, this was just a wireframe. I was just using blue to indicate that you could click on that. So now the designer looks sort of defensive and the product owner looks kind of clueless. So we teach designers to tee meetings up and say, this is the kind of feedback that I need to get from you at this stage. But if they don't do it, then we would ask you to ask them what they need from you, because the kind of feedback that they need at the strategy level is really different from the kind of feedback that they need at the surface level. So this is another opportunity to give good feedback. And then once you've done that, related to feedback, my second recommendation and kind of wrapping things up is to focus on intent. I don't know what the icon is for intent. Feel free to tweet at me if you have a better icon for intent, but this is what I use. So users have intent, right? And then the designer is keeping the user's intent in mind. And then the business has its intent. And the designer kind of squaring those things has her own. But product managers and business leaders in general have that unique opportunity and perspective to see all of it. And so, and to rationalize across all those things, to balance and make them make sense, look for opportunities where they overlap. So when I say focus on intent in a feedback setting, usually that means asking a lot of questions. So asking questions about the user's intent. How do they do it today? What are they really trying to do? How would this solution make it better? And then asking about the designer's intent. What version do you like? Why did you do it this way? Why do you like that one best? And then talking, of course, about your own intent and the business's intent, like what you need to make sure that this addresses, and both for yourself and to take advantage of the opportunity that you see in the market, and also to make the business successful. So this is my sort of final opportunity that I wanted to call out. So I have, just to wrap up, sorry, one last thing. It's funny, I've given this talk before in different forms, and the one thing that is always the most controversial is this section, which is just this one slide. Designers design all the things. You would be surprised outside of Silicon Valley, and even within Silicon Valley, how many companies have digital products that people are using and have no designers. And that's not to say that there's no design. There's the old saying, the alternative to good design isn't no design, it's bad design. It's just that somebody is doing that design work and being paid to do the design work that maybe isn't trained or the most skilled person at design. So here's the controversial slide. So 3 ideas for tomorrow, just to think about how you might do something differently tomorrow because you came to this talk, and Yuki's going to add a lot to this, so I'm excited to hear what he has to say. But I would suggest using one of the criteria at the beginning of the deck, so the reports that talk about the value of design, and each one of those has an index that describes some level of design maturity. So you could pick one of those. I would recommend the Envision one, and score your team. Work together with your team to score your business, and set a new goal and see if you can get it. Maybe ask your design team where they have the most impact today and where they wish they had more, and insist on helping. And finally, try sort of the Socratic method of design review. So attend a review meeting and try using only questions and no statements to understand, to elicit intent and kind of interrogate it, which creates great partnerships with designers, and also, I believe, makes them better designers. So that wraps it up for me. We're Design Map. These are crazy times. We're a small business with a lot of great designers. So please reach out if you have any particular design needs, or if you just want to chat more about this stuff.
Okay, thank you so much, Audrey. That was a really awesome talk.
Yeah.
Definitely appreciate you coming and joining us here. hopefully all of our listeners on YouTube got a lot out of it. I'm sure that if we were in a live setting, everyone would be, applauding right now. So, hopefully they're clapping at home.
I'm sure they are. I can hear it from here.
Yeah, cool. So next up, for all you product folks out there, we've got Yuhki Yamashita. He's VP of Product at Figma. He's got a great talk for you along the same lines as Audrey's regarding design. And this one is Working with Designers, a Product Manager's Guide.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can people hear me? Just want to.
Yep, we hear you, Yuhki.
All right. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thanks, Audrey, for that talk. I think there are a lot of similar themes that are going to weave our talks together. But as mentioned, today I want to talk a little bit about working with designers, and I'm going to take on a little bit more of the perspective of the PM, having been in a variety of roles, and give you a bunch of practical tips on how to work well with designers. And in order to do that, I want to first talk a little bit about my journey as a product manager and my interactions with design, because I think it helps kind of set the stage a little bit. Coming out of college, this was the first product I worked on, and it is in fact Hotmail for those of you who are around to recognize it. Before you all tune out and think like, why is this guy even talking about design? Let me make a case. The first feature that I actually worked on in Hotmail was this thing we internally called bubbles, but it was basically just tooltips. Tooltips that pointed to different features to educate users about them, help them onboard onto Hotmail. So something that looked like this. And the team that was working on it was this team with Eric, our engineer, Josh and Test, and myself as product manager. And one of the things that you might notice from this is, a notable omission, which is that we didn't have a designer. And we were a small team. We didn't really matter much to Microsoft at the time. So we didn't even have a designer assigned to us. So the task of figuring out exactly what some of these tooltips look like and it behaved like fell on me. Coming out of college and this being my first experience in a professional setting doing design, it was super exciting for me. And there was just really important questions, at least, from my perspective, like, oh, what should the tooltip look like? Where should the beak of the tooltip be? And, what shape should it be taking? Is it on the bottom? Is it on the side? What should the style be? Rounded corners are becoming a thing. But also there are other kinds of like darker colors that could attract more attention. How do you close a tooltip? That was a really big one. Do you have an X button? Do you have a dismiss button? Or do you just tap out? And, I went crazy and explored all these different permutations. And here you see kind of like 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, 81 different permutations that I prototyped and looked at and just went all really crazy. So that was my first foray into UI design at Hotmail. But thereafter, I had the opportunity to move on to slightly bigger things. And I moved down from Seattle to the Bay Area and started working at YouTube. And I was responsible for this app right here, which is the YouTube app on iOS. And at the time, there's a company-wide strategy to really focus on subscriptions as an alternative revenue stream to ads. In particular, we really wanted to make music work. And so this was, when you think about a music subscription, you want to make sure that you can listen to music anywhere, meaning that, even if you don't have connectivity, you want to be able to listen to it. So we had to figure out how to download and offline music within the YouTube context. Or another obvious feature that's part of it is being able to listen to it in the background. And these are table stakes for music apps. And it seems really simple on the surface level to integrate some of these things. But being a video app, it wasn't incredibly intuitive how some of these things would fit. So for example, if you're watching a cat video and there are 15 seconds left to the video and you close the app, do you really want that to continue playing in the background? Probably not. But in the case of a music video, you definitely do want to continue playing other stuff as well. So what do you do in those cases? Do you have different behaviors based on the type of video? Do you have a setting? And so, there are a lot of interesting UX problems here. And this being YouTube and such a widely used app, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of talented designers in this context. And I would say this was the first time I worked with a bunch of designers on product. Following YouTube, I moved over to Uber. And I was responsible for the rider app, the app that riders like you and I use to book an Uber. And believe it or not, this was actually a real screenshot, I think, of somewhere in Chicago, I want to say. And if you look at the bottom, you can see all the different products that we offered at the time. On the very right, you have Uber Elves, which was, I think, some kind of Christmas promo. We had Uber Rush, where we had kind of courier service and a bunch of different other products. I was tasked with figuring out how to build something that's a little bit more scalable and provide a way for our users to really understand the difference between these products and trade them off against each other. And as part of this, we had the opportunity to do a complete redesign of the product, where we first started by asking you where you're going. And by asking you your destination, which we actually, believe it or not, didn't used to do, then we can move on and show you the different product offerings and offer you the price-time trade-off, for example. So that was the big redesign that I first worked with. And as you can tell, just based on the quality of these assets, which I did not make, I had the one opportunity to work with some of the most world-class designers as part of this project. And then I proceeded to work on a number of other products at Uber. And then near the tail end of my career, I had the opportunity to actually switch over from product to design. So at the time, Uber had created this new division called New Mobility. It was focused on new modes of transit like bikes, scooters, and public transit. And I had the opportunity to lead the design teams that were working on it and experience what it's like to work on the design side of the house as well, which was really cool. And then lastly, most recently, about a year ago, I switched over to Figma. Figma is the tool that we were using at Uber, so I was familiar with it. And as some of you may know, Figma's mission is about making design accessible to everyone. And here, it's not only about working with a bunch of talented designers again, but also working with designers as the customer. And also figuring out we are about collaborating in real time together and bringing everyone in the product team, not just designers, into the process. So this is an opportunity to not just work with designers as customers, but also redefine what design is about. So, in summary, this has been kind of my career to date, starting from a PM without any designers, at YouTube, starting to work closely with designers, at Uber, getting to a point where they let me manage some design teams, and then now working on a product for designers. And a lot of this journey has been trying to figure out kind of this relationship between PM and design. And one of the things that I want to talk about today, and to kind of motivate the problem here, is this kind of so-called tension between design and PM. And in order to describe it, I want to give a kind of fictional account of an exchange, a typical exchange between a designer and PM. So this is Jenny, a designer at Figma, and she gave me permission to kind of like create this fictional account. But at the same time, I'm hoping that all of you can kind of relate to an exchange that looks like this. So, your designer might ping you and say, hey, here's the new designs. And of course, you'd respond to that as the PM, and you want a little bit more, or you want to give a little bit of feedback. So you give it to the designer. Designer comes back with another rev. And you being a PM still have a little bit more feedback to give. And, you're waiting for the feedback, waiting for her to respond. That like at this point, maybe she's, ignoring you because you've just been a little bit annoying about all the feedback. But, all this is pretty normal. But then you commit this cardinal sin where you say, okay, you know what? I don't want to bother you. I can mock some of these things up. And this might be how the designer responds. And from here, we start kind of like what I call the journey of like PM art or PM design. And I actually think there's different levels to this. And this is just totally based on my own experiences where, the level 1 PM design is just doing some very basic wireframes. Maybe you might use a tool like Balsamiq. And, when you show the designer this, it's pretty safe. They think it's cute that you design, and it's all good. Level 2, this is also something that I did, which is when, you start to do a little bit more what I call like slide design, where there are screenshots inside the deck already, and you're starting to kind of like manipulate it by putting text boxes on top of it to make it fit in the flow in the deck. So this is a little bit in the realm of sketchy, but still probably okay, right? You're still kind of respecting the designer's work. And then level 3 is where you really get into danger territory, where, oftentimes you don't actually have access to the source file. So you might take kind of like a PNG that they've created, and then you might take it into Photoshop, push some pixels to kind of manipulate it to get it to where you want. And you kind of quickly get into this world where there's the designer's design and then there's the PM design. And I hope this feels familiar to you, but it certainly did. And there's a point in which I felt really bad about doing all these things, but sometimes it was just necessary to get some of the work done. And of course, I worked at Figma, where we believe that design is just design and everyone can partake in it. And this is a time lapse of a design crit that we recently did. And in here, you can kind of see all these different people, engineers, researchers, PMs, designers alike, coming in, giving feedback on the designs, oftentimes just like riffing on top of it, copy pasting something next to it and changing it up. And this is how we believe design should be. And in fact, our vision of it is more like, in the past, we had something on the left where designers, PMs, engineers were very siloed, and there's a bunch of handoffs that were happening between them of different files and forms of feedback in the way the PM and designer Jenny and I were talking earlier. The present looks more like this, where it's much more interlocked. Sometimes the PM does some designs. There are designers that code, engineers who like to do the PM work, and all vice versa. And that's where we believe the state of the world really is. But that might leave you with a question around, even in this world where there's all these overlapping boundaries, what are ways in which PMs and designers can work better? Or as a PM, how can you make that relationship good? And that's what I'm here to address today in the form of a bunch of practical tips that I've picked up over my time being a product manager. So practical tips. And being a PM, of course, have to use a pyramid to kind of like frameworkize this. But the way I think about it is there's 3 broad buckets. The first one is just building some basic trust, right? You need to get to a point where designers actually trust you, and that's where the foundation of your relationship. The second bucket is around giving useful feedback. Feedback is the most common transaction that you're making between with a designer, and it's actually a really tricky area. So I'll give you some tips in that. And then finally, thinking about how you provide unique value, having established trust and being able to give good feedback. So I'm going to just dive right in starting with the foundations. So my first tip around building trust is just simply to speak the language of the designer. And that language is always about taking the user's point of view. So, I have some PM speak versus design speak slides here. PMs love to talk about KPIs and features, and designers really want to hear about, the actual value that it delivers to customers. Or, instead of talking about features, they want to understand what use cases it actually enables, or what user journeys that we actually really care about. So these are just subtle ways in which you kind of reposition some of these things to be much more user-centric. But a more specific example is the way you might talk about experience. I can't tell you how many times I've heard something like this, where you run an experiment, an A/B test and control treatment, and the PM would say something like, the treatment group outperformed the controls, so we're just rolling it out. Which sounds totally reasonable to say, but a designer sits there and this is really unsatisfactory, because from their perspective, they want to understand why users behave this way. They want to understand the user psychology that led the users to behave differently because the button is somewhere else or rendered differently. And a lot of the times, instead of just saying that this experiment worked, you want to take a lesson away from how it affected users so you can apply it to your next design. So this is, again, a subtle way in which you can build trust by using the language of designers by putting the customer first. The second tip is an important one. It's really about appreciating and defending the details, which is something that designers really care about instead of MVPing absolutely everything. So, designers care about users, they care about stories, but they really care about quality experiences. And one really easy way to just make a designer cry is to say things like this. Okay, we'll mark that polish as P2 being kind of like second order priority. Or, oh, that's not in the scope of the MVP, right? And one of the things that, I've started to realize over time was that a lot of times PMs kind of assume that quality experiences is just polish, right? And that polish is necessarily, a second order priority, right? But, the reality is that it's actually not this simple, and it's much more nuanced than this. And I was actually reminded of this a few weeks ago, where we had two launches that were within 2 days of each other. On the left-hand side, we had a major feature launch, and it took a lot of work and a lot of things packed into it. And on the right-hand side, it was just like a minor UI improvement where we made numbers, the way we rendered numbers, much more visible. And what was really surprising to us was that the minor UI improvement was the one that was much more well received. And not to say like Twitter likes is the only way in which we measure things at Figma, but it's certainly a surprise to us that it was as well received, if not more, than the major feature update. And as a reminder that, all these things that you might just consider polish actually can make a remarkable difference to the customer experience. Another example of how kind of this polish has had impact comes from an experience I had at Uber, where I also had the opportunity to work with a team to redesign the driver app. So on the left-hand side, this is what the driver app used to look like. It's pretty cluttered. And on the right-hand side, we redesigned it. But one of the particular details that we focused on was how drivers actually get online. So on the left-hand side, it was a toggle. And on the right-hand side, we had this kind of pulsating go button. And, you can look at this kind of academically and say, well, a toggle is the best way to have an on-off state. And that's definitely true. But one of the feelings we had, and especially the sentiment at the time, was that it dehumanized the driver in a way. All you're saying is you're just on or off, and you're accepting requests. And what we wanted this to feel like was the start of your work day. And you go online, and you should be excited about it, and you're about to make a bunch of money. And there was that sense of mobility that was really important to us. So that moment of going online was the quote unquote polish or quality experience where we wanted that moment of joy. And, you could argue that extra day of work to make this experience really great feels like much lower priority than a bunch of other stuff that we need to do for the driver app. But one of the things we found was that this became central to the way we communicated this redesign. And it became part of how we branded the entire app. So on the left-hand side, we actually built this big, giant kind of go button for a stage where Dara, our CEO, unveiled the new driver app. And on the right-hand side, we had a whole marketing campaign around how, this new driver app was about facilitating this mobility, and it really spoke to the emotion of going online and being your own boss. So this, again, this isn't necessarily advocating for these kind of animations all throughout. And not to say that polish is just these things, but it is a good reminder that, these are ways in which, a particular kind of detail can have a lot of impact as well. And one last thing on polish is that oftentimes, people think it's just, extra work. But the reality is that sometimes it can actually come for free. And this is something I realized with this example. So on the left-hand side was what 2016, the rider app looked like on Uber, and the cars looked like on the map. And the right-hand side, what it looked like for Lyft at the time. And, already kind of like Uber felt ahead insofar as, the cars looked a little bit more realistic, and they actually rotated and things like that. But one of the designers, Peter on the team, got really excited about taking it to the next level. And he came from a 3D background, and he wanted to make it so that, as cars were turning, you could actually see the other side of the car and look much more kind of real. And in fact, he was so excited that he built this prototype. He used this clever method when, as cars are turning, you would actually swap out the underlying sprites. So it would actually look like you had a 3D model, when really it was just a bunch of different kind of GIFs that were changing. And one of the things he did was he just built this prototype, was really passionate about it, and he showed it to an engineer to say, check this out. Showed it to Sammy, our iOS engineer, and he responded to that by saying, you know what, this is too cool not to build. Let's just do it and forget about costs. I'll just get it done. And he spent a weekend to do this, and he was super proud about it. And this was kind of a good reminder that there's just this social aspect to building. It's a really human process. Sometimes you kind of want to formalize this in terms of cost and kind of justify it. But at the end of the day, the engineers can be motivated in this way too, because they want to build experiences that are special. And the lesson that I took away from this was, You know, sometimes like next time the designer comes up with a really radical idea that I don't think can technically be prioritized, you know, officially, I just encourage them to go talk to engineers and make a case for it. And oftentimes, if it's a really cool idea, you know, it actually goes through. And, you know, that's how a lot of things get built in the real world. And then the last tip is something kind of Audrey alluded to in terms of designer involvement. But this is just such a common mistake that I just thought it would be worth writing down, which is to making sure that designers are presenting their work to stakeholders. Oftentimes, you're the one setting up these meetings, building these decks, so you can kind of forget and in that flow present everything on behalf of the designer. But there's nothing worse than that to make designers feel like they don't have a seat at the table. So I think it's really important part of building trust to let designers present the work that they work on. So that was a little bit about kind of the basics of building trust. But this next section, I think, is really the crux of this this talk in terms of how you give useful feedback, because this is often the trickiest part. And my first tip around this is just to first zoom out before zooming in. And it's really, really tempting to just start by zooming in. So I'll give you an example. So this is another one of those like real screenshots that's hard to believe that it's real. And you can tell that a lot is going on. And the zoomed in feedback that you can give maybe during a design crit is to start asking a bunch of these questions like, oh, well, I don't understand these green dots. Like, what are they about? Or why isn't the primary CTA more prominent? The primary CTA, by the way, is this black button in the middle. And you know, all of this is really valid feedback. But the zoomed out version of this is something like this, where you first ask, well, what is your goal with this design? What are you hoping the user will do? And you know, you'll eventually get at the same thing, but you allow us, the designer, to talk about some of the goals, the problems that they were trying to solve, and maybe therein lies the problem, and you can start kind of like fixing that. And so it's really important to not be tempted to point out some of these details, but rather start zoomed out because it helps up-level the conversation. I'll talk a little bit about this more on this later, but that's the first step. The second tip is something that Audrey explicitly mentioned, and I totally agree with, which is to make sure you ask what kind of feedback they're looking for. So I'll give you the same example again, where you could give all this zoomed in feedback and say, you know what, we don't really use this shade of green, that's really inconsistent, or like what about this edge case where you're not able to fetch this data, and it's like how do we show this error state? And the designer's sitting there saying, I don't know, who the hell cares? Like, I haven't even gotten there right now. I just want to get a sense of whether this is the right approach. And so, I think this is a really important thing where, at Figma, for example, whenever we do a design crit, the first question we ask is, what kind of feedback are you looking for? And oftentimes, a designer might say, actually, I want you to treat this as the final UI and give me all the details that you think are off about it and give me feedback around that. And sometimes it's, these are a bunch of different explorations. I want a gut check of, which ones feel promising. And other times it's more generative. And all this is really making sure that designers are getting, as much out of the session as possible. But it's also about making sure that, that designers are getting kind of the right feedback at the right time. And this is kind of what Audrey was relating, talking about earlier too, where, getting feedback about the particular execution when actually you want to talk about the strategic level is really not useful. So that was the second tip in this feedback area. And then the next tip here is, this is probably the most important tip, is what to do when you think a design is quote unquote bad. And it's a really difficult situation to be in. And I think a lot of times PMs don't handle it really well. But my biggest advice here is to just start from a place of empathy and to assume that it's actually not the designer's fault. It's the fault of the constraints, right? And that what you can do is start debugging the constraints that actually likely led to the design. So again, I'll kind of get back to our favorite example here, right? And you might point out things like, there's a schedule ride button down there, and it feels really weird. Like, why is it floating down there? Why is it, it's a very different style of button. It has nothing to do with the map, maybe even sets this dangerous precedent that, more things can clutter the map. And you can start to go down that path. But if you step down and kind of like take this empathetic perspective and say, well, what could have led a designer to propose this? Some details might surface. Like, for example, you realize, okay, a schedule rides team is super new. They're really small and they're under a lot of pressure because 2 months ago, Lyft announced a schedule rides feature, and they're having to crank out something as quickly as possible. And maybe they want to do it in an experimental way. And so the assumption they might have made is that, like integrating it more natively into the rest of the UI might be a better solution, but they wanted to make sure that they can get something quickly out and get a bunch of signal first, right? And so it's not necessarily saying this is the right design, but it does allow you to be much more empathetic of why they might have chosen this particular placement or this particular style. Or another good example is this one where he talked about this is actually the primary CTA. And you could argue that, well, this doesn't feel like a button. Like, why would you not just put a primary kind of CTA at the very bottom where it's ergonomically accessible? But here too, if you zoom out for a second, you play that out, you're like, well, like you could design that way, but then that would kind of make it so that, it's taking up more vertical space and giving less space to the map. And maybe it's really important that we see more of the map because the people are trying to pick up location. And again, here, if you play out some of these things, you can understand why a designer might have made this particular choice, even if it was wrong. Or another thing here too, where you ask, why is it the case that destination entries feels optional, or that you can do this before you set your pickup location or change your product on the bottom? And I think this is another case of maybe the designer is assuming that they can't completely redesign the app so that they can ask for one piece of information at a time. Or maybe they're afraid to make destination entry forced because it might actually add another step to the funnel and decrease conversion. So all these kind of examples of zooming out to think about the constraints have this interesting effect of allowing you to kind of critique the design, actually critique the assumptions that led to the design. And first of all, you're better equipped to navigate these assumptions and these constraints in the first place as a PM, because you have a wide purview of these different trade-offs. But also, it actually starts from a place of empathy, because you're basically saying, you probably designed the best design possible given the constraints, but what I want to challenge is those constraints, and let me help relax some of those so that we can land on a better design. And over time, I think you'll realize that there are a lot of common culprits of this nature. So some constraints that actually often lead to what you might think are quote unquote bad designs are things like when, designs are really optimized for design system or pattern consistency. Often for a particular screen, you want a CTA to be much more prominent, but that's not part of the system. And maybe the designer doesn't feel equipped to really refactor the system. Or really another common example is like they've just restricted the solution space due to presumed scope. Maybe they have the idea of engineering costs, or maybe a sense of team ownership where they're not allowed to touch that part of the UI or something like that. And that caused them to explore some solutions that were pretty limited. Or maybe a designer has a different sense of the importance of different use cases and weighted it very differently. All of these, if you just kind of talk about this level, you can have a really successful and fruitful discussion that doesn't feel like it's just an attack on a designer's ability to execute, but rather kind of up-levels that conversation. And my last tip in this area around feedback is just helping distance the author from the work. This is an essay that I read in college whose title kind of stuck with me for a while. The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes. And in this essay, I won't go into it too much, but he was contesting this idea of the times when people were kind of talking a lot about authorial intent. This idea that the value of art or of writing is just really understanding kind of what the author really meant. And he was arguing for a world where those pieces of art were standalone things, and we should be analyzing what effect it is having on the audience today. So that sounds super overly academic maybe, but it's resonated with me when thinking about it from the perspective of a designer, where a user interview product isn't really thinking about what the designer meant, right? Like that's not even in their head. And it's a really good reminder that at the end of the day, your user experiences that product in a really much more kind of like objective way. So, if we go back to our favorite example again, some really basic ways to do this is to, instead of saying kind of, something like your use of different button types makes it hard to understand the primary CTA, just talk about the use of different button types in this design. And immediately this feels a little bit more objective. You're not criticizing the designer, you're instead criticizing the work, right? This is pretty basic. I think a lot of people already do this. But maybe a more nuanced version of is something like this, where someone might say, I feel the visual hierarchy of this is hard to follow. And on the surface, this is actually like really good feedback. But in some ways, it's actually much better if you can focus the critique on how users are actually experiencing it. So it doesn't really matter what you think about the visual hierarchy as a product manager. And kind of express that from like the PM's perspective, from the user's perspective, that's much more objective. So one trick I actually like to use is the screen reader trick, which is to say, like, what if a screen reader were to describe this page to the user, what would it say? And whenever there's a screen that I see where the visual hierarchy or the information architecture is really unclear, I kind of ask this question, and it makes it really clear what should be important, what should be popping up. But most importantly, it feels like we're talking about it from like the way it will be consumed at the very end, instead of these kind of more academic designer terms. And then last, if you get to this place where you've built some trust and you've talked about kind of like you've had the ability to give useful feedback, then you're thinking about how to provide unique value. And as a PM, your number one job with a designer is to make it so that designers can efficiently get to the best solution possible. And oftentimes the best way to do this, and this is a tip here, is actually for you to focus on the problem, not the solution, right? Ensuring you've clearly defined the right problem is probably the best way to help your designer. And I actually have a pretty opinionated view on this. And when I think about kind of like PM, designer, engineer responsibilities, oftentimes they're blurred, but what I definitely hold the PM accountable is for the why. Why are we working on this? Why this over anything else? Why is this important? And if we don't establish that, then none of the rest follows. And it's possible that what we build might be coming from designers, maybe how we build it comes from engineers, or a mix of these. But the PM's really is accountable for the why, because if that's not really well defined, it doesn't really matter what's built or how it's built. And at Figma, we actually have these intentional moments where if we're doing a product review, we might actually have a problem alignment review, where before we see any of the solutions, we ask what problem you're trying to solve. Because if we don't get aligned on that, it's not worth exploring any solutions. And the kind of worst things you can do is when a designer's designed a bunch of different solutions, and someone comes to you and asks, challenges the very premise of the problem in the first place, and that's just a bunch of wasted work. And we also do this, kind of enforce the structure through our PRDs as well. So in a PRD template, there's a problem alignment section. I often encourage my PMs to fill this out first, even send that around for feedback before filling out the rest. So this is really about focusing on the problem, because that's the best way to make sure that you can help your designer be much more efficient in their exploration of the solution. But you can play a role in the solutioning as well. And one thing that I've found, and this is my last tip of the day, is the role that you can play here is just helping synthesize some of the explorations and defining the solution space. So I'll explain what I mean. Some of the best relationships I've had with designers is when we've played these different roles where one person is generating a bunch of different solutions and the other person is synthesizing them. And so Peter, who worked on the Uber, was really great at coming up with a bunch of different ideas. But it was really important that someone else like me played this role of organizing it in a way that was really easy to react to. And so that we can talk about trade-offs in the right kind of way, instead of looking at 100 different ideas at once. And Julie Droll, who used to work at Facebook for a long time, drew a series of these diagrams that I really like about how the junior designer's process looks like, in terms of, it's like this long and winding road, and full of rabbit holes, and they finally get to, their solution at the end. But it's a very kind of like long journey. And a senior designer works in this way, where it's much more deliberate, where you come up with your different options, you explore, you terminate the exploration, and because you find that's not working, and you go on to the next, right? And I actually think that this is where PMs can provide a lot of value as well, where PMs can be the ones that can help define some of these branches in the first place, or at least discuss some of the trade-offs so that you can help your designers really cut off these branches of exploration early. And so this is where I found that PMs can provide a lot of value, not just generating solutions, but rather organizing them in ways that can help make designers much more efficient. So those are my practical tips for how to work well with designers, starting with trust, focusing a lot on feedback, and then thinking about how to provide unique value. And that's all I have for today. This talk is available on my Figma community profile, and you can feel free to use it, remix it in whatever you want. It's made in Figma, so feel free to use whatever's in there. And I would love to hear your feedback as well. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and that's all I got.
All right, thank you so much, Yuhki. That's really awesome. I want to thank everyone today, Audrey and Yuhki. Both of you guys, you did a great job. I also want to thank all the ProductTank SF organizers and co-organizers who helped out with this event. We couldn't have done it without you. We're going to skip Q&A for today, but we will be adding Q&A in future events if we continue doing virtual events. We are hoping to get more of these out. It's a new thing for us, and we really want to try to reach out to the community in these times and continue, being providing a ProductTank community and source for cool learning like this. So thank you guys so much. And if you have any questions, I'm sure you guys can reach out to Yuhki or Audrey on Twitter or LinkedIn. Do you guys have any final comments?
No, just really appreciate you having us. I think it's a really important topic, and really excited to continue the conversation. And also thanks for everyone for tuning in. I know it's can be weird to experience this in a digital way, but it's really cool that we've adapted to the times.
Yeah, I totally agree. It was really fun to hear Yuhki's talk and your point of view, and appreciate having the chance to move forward and help everybody else do it too.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I really look forward to talking with you guys more about this. There was a lot of great content in those talks that I'd love to dig in deeper with you guys on. With that, I'll just say thanks one more time to our community. Stay safe and healthy, and have a great evening.